we aren't curious in a vacuum as individual knowers. We are always social knowers. We are socially searching for questions, and the kinds of questions that we ask because of our interactions with other people, and how we ask them that way because of interactions with other people, et cetera, et cetera. So we're social creatures, and the knowledge that we're seeking isn't discrete bits of information that can be sort of grabbed, again, out of a vacuum or out of the sky and then plugged into something else. It also sits in some kind of network, a social network of concepts and lineages and experiences and perceptions and realities around it. So given that social complexity, that the social networks of the knower and the thing they're trying to know, we really need something more complex, more illuminative than simply information gap filling.
Hello, my geeslings. This is Mother Goose, Robinson Earhart, here with the introduction to Robinson's podcast number 98. And this episode is with Dani S. Bassett and Perry Zurn. And Dani is the J. Peter Skirkanich Professor of Bioengineering at the University of Pennsylvania. And Perry Zurn, their brother, is Provost Associate Professor of Philosophy at American University. So not only are Dani and Perry identical twins, but they're also co-authors of a book, Curious Minds, The Power of Connection, that came out in 2022. And Curious Minds blends work in their respective fields, so physics, neuroscience on Dani's side, and philosophy and literature on Perry's, because they both do a lot of interdisciplinary research. And physics and neuroscience, philosophy and literature is already pretty reductive, considering all the things that they research. But they blend work in their respective fields to articulate a novel theory of curiosity that, as opposed to, sorry, that's Mishka the Vishla shaking out his ears, that as opposed to characterizing curiosity as something along the lines of a merely acquisitive characteristic, stresses the importance of relationships between ideas and people in knowledge networks, which we, of course, get into. So along the way, we talk about complex systems, how curiosity has been studied from a variety of different academic perspectives, like psychology, philosophy, neuroscience, and then the three curiosity-embodying archetypes that they've identified, which are the busybody, the dancer, and the hunter. And then, the possible curiosity of large language models and a lot more besides. But some links. Curious Minds naturally is linked in the description. You should also check out Dani and Perry's websites. So Dani's website is danisbassett.com. Perry's is perryzurn.com. And then Dani's on Twitter at danisbassett, not .com, just at Dani S. Bassett. And Perry's on Twitter at perryzurn. And so, without any further ado, I hope you enjoy this conversation as much as I enjoyed having it with Dani and Perry. As I was preparing for this conversation, it occurred to me that Aristotle might as well have deemed us the curious animal, considering just how much curiosity characterizes our thoughts and what we do. But as you point out in the introduction to Curious Minds, curiosity, it's more than just a feeling or an action or a way of thinking, but it's also all of these things. And because it's so complex, I feel like before we delve into the various avenues of curiosity you've explored, whether that's in physics, literature, philosophy, or wherever, we first ought to narrow our scope a bit and try to say just what it is. So maybe for starters, because curiosity can apply to so many things, are you interested in the specifically human faculty of curiosity? Because just as Aristotle characterized humans as the rational animal, my cat is also capable of some rudimentary reasoning, and she's certainly curious as well.
I'm certainly, and I think I speak for both of us when I say that I'm interested in thinking about curiosity across a spectrum of beings, and not just a spectrum of beings, but also organizations and institutions. So groups of people, and perhaps even artificially intelligent systems. So I think that there's a lot of places where we can start to think about the exploration of knowledge, the creation of knowledge, and innovation. It would behoove us to keep those doors open and to ask where curiosity goes, rather than assign in advance that it is only the purview of these special things called humans.
So curiosity is absolutely substrate neutral, I guess we would say.
Dani, what do you think?
Yeah, and definitely in the scientific study of curiosity, there have been investigations into curiosity displayed by primates, but also by pigeons, for example. And certainly the example of the cat is a great one. So, yes, I think both from the science and philosophy perspective and from our personal perspectives, we're interested in curiosity across beings.
Mm-hmm. And you describe your account of curiosity as a network account. And like me, I'm sure most of my listeners are familiar with literature and philosophy, two of your specialties, Perry, and then neuroscience and physics, Dani. But they probably don't know much about complex systems, or maybe they've never heard of it. So before we say just what a network account of curiosity looks like, could you explain what complex systems is in a nutshell?
Yeah, absolutely. So a complex system is often characterized as one that is composed of many individual parts that interact with one another in complicated ways, and that it's from that separation into parts and their interactions that complex or complicated, unexpected dynamics can occur, or functions can be made possible by the system. So a complex system typically has unusual, exciting, different, complicated functions that are made possible by this separation into units that interact in intricate ways.
And Dani, you mentioned a few minutes ago that there have been studies of curiosity on pigeons and primates. And in general, though, I think different departments within a university think of curiosity differently. The two of you, though you're two bodies, one mind, as you put it in your book, you think about curiosity differently. And so, like, the neuroscientists and the psychologists explain curiosity differently. And within even a philosophy department, Perry, the ancient philosophers might conceive of curiosity as a sort of virtue, while the continental philosophers might describe it in a completely different way. But I thought we might start, since you brought it up already, Perry, with psychologists and neuroscientists. How do they typically conceive of curiosity?
So curiosity has been defined in all sorts of ways. I think, according to philosophical history, the common description has been a desire to know. And as psychology became its own field of inquiry, it wanted to make that a little bit more precise, right? What is desire? That seems to lose us a little bit. So in psychology, it's often described as a motivation to explore. That's a really canonical or traditional definition. It can also be described as a drive or motivation to fill an information gap. So that's those are definitions that are common in psychology. And then in neuroscience, Dani, you might want to jump in here.
Yeah, in neuroscience, many investigators have considered those definitions from psychology, but there have been additional complications because the neural signatures associated with curiosity are really disparate. So, in other words, there doesn't seem to be a single piece of the brain that is active when we are curious. It's not so easy as understanding the neural correlates of movement, where there is a region of the brain that lights up when you move your right hand or your left hand, and it's a different region. So, but with curiosity, it's not one region, and it's become difficult to distinguish between the set of regions that become active when we are curious and the set of regions that become active when we are motivated and attentive and being rewarded for something that we want. So reward circuits and and attention circuits are involved in curious behaviors. So I think the neuroscientists have, at least some of them, have said that, maybe we need a clearer or different definition of curiosity that would allow us to isolate the component parts, perhaps, and that would allow us to identify why it's this particular set of regions that's being activated when we are curious. There's actually one or two neuroscientists who, sort of at the end of their paper, kind of throw up their hands a little bit and say, I don't know, maybe we can't define curiosity yet. And maybe we should not even try to have explicit hypotheses from a neuroscience perspective about what curiosity is and does in the brain. Maybe it's too early in the field. So they do recommend continuing to run studies, but sort of maybe without precise hypotheses, which obviously is just a tricky thing to do or get funded or other things from the scientific perspective. So that's an interesting place for neuroscience to be, because I think it motivates turning to other fields.
And returning to psychology for a moment, how does the psychological conception of curiosity relate to something called the information gap theory? And I saw in your book that this is very problematic.
Well, I don't know that I would necessarily say problematic. I mean, the different frameworks that have been used to illuminate curiosity have been helpful in certain ways. But for us, at any rate, when you think about curiosity as filling an information gap, you imagine that curiosity is searching for a specific piece of information that is really required to fit into some larger picture, and that piece of information typically gets described as sought out by an individual knower. So an individual knower, a person, a participant in a research study, wants to know something, and then they end up finding that thing, and then they can fill their little information gap. But this leaves out a lot about how we see the complexity with which we see curiosity on two levels, at least. One is we aren't curious in a vacuum as individual knowers. We are always social knowers. We are socially searching for questions, and the kinds of questions that we ask because of our interactions with other people, and how we ask them that way because of interactions with other people, et cetera, et cetera. So we're social creatures, and the knowledge that we're seeking isn't discrete bits of information that can be sort of grabbed, again, out of a vacuum or out of the sky and then plugged into something else. It also sits in some kind of network, a social network of concepts and lineages and experiences and perceptions and realities around it. So given that social complexity, that the social networks of the knower and the thing they're trying to know, we really need something more complex, more illuminative than simply information gap filling.
Mm-hmm. And I think that this idea of people as social knowers really leads into this network account. And maybe you could say now just what the network account of curiosity is and how it relates to this term I hadn't seen anywhere before, edge work. I'm wondering if that's a term of art or if it just comes from graph theory or something like that.
So yeah, if we are social knowers and we're trying to get to understand knowledge which is already also situated in a network of concepts, then we need essentially a network account of curiosity, and that network account, we need to have some kind of fundamentals of what a network is. Network theory started in the 1970s, roughly, in sociology, and it allows us to think about the relationship between what are called nodes, which are the individual sections of a network, and then the edges that connect them, or the relationships. So in a social network, for example, the nodes are the people, and the edges are the relationships between the people, friendship and friends, enemies, family, whatever. So in the same way, when we start to think about curiosity from a network perspective, Dani and I argue that curiosity is this capacity to build connections between nodes of knowledge, nodes of affect, nodes of experience, nodes of fact, etc. And that capacity to build Connections is a capacity to build edges, to make relationships between the things that we're coming to know and experience and share. So edge work is a term that I did in the in the hideaway moment of writing, think I came up with. It seemed to make good sense and it sounded wonderful. But afterwards, I realized, after having done some research, it has shown up in a number of different fields, especially in ecologies. So the edge work would be situated on the edges between ecological networks, and also in art theory. So this is a term that people have come to for a variety of reasons. We think it's really helpful in connection with curiosity. But Dani, maybe you can precise all of that a bit more.
Yeah, maybe I will just add that the network account of curiosity allows us to not focus on the piece of information that the person is searching for, and also not sort of count how many pieces of information they're searching for, or quantify people's curiosity with this acquisitional approach that is not monetary, but certainly agglomerative, and instead focus on understanding curiosity as the capacity to connect pieces of information or connect knowers to one another in a growing network. And that provides us with a way of thinking through the mental affordances of curiosity. Curiosity isn't just about collecting a new piece of information, because you can't actually do anything with a single piece of information that's not connected to anything else. The only way that we can do something with a piece of information is if we can connect it, either through inference or through comparison, through contrast, through reasoning. Reasoning requires us to hold multiple pieces of information at the same time and do something with them. So the connectional account of curiosity allows us to bridge from this notion of acquiring to something that is much more functional to a human or to a non-human being. And that function becomes then something that we can understand differently when people are connecting information differently.
And Perry, you said that curiosity is, or you described curiosity as this capacity to build connections between nodes of a network. And Perry, you described also how this works on some levels within a social network. But I take it that the same theory also applies to how an individual brain works. And I'm wondering, Dani, if you could describe a bit how this works, or how this happens within a brain, how this theory corresponds to what's going on
in the brain. Yeah, there's some really interesting work recently that has shown that we humans are able to connect pieces of information together with one another in a network architecture, and has specifically identified an area of the brain called the hippocampus, and also sort of more broadly what's called the hippocampal entorhinal system, as a system of the brain that allows us to make these maps between concepts or between objects, and they're network maps. So there's a particular piece of the hippocampal entorhinal system that codes for whether two things are connected, sort of yes or no, it's a binary decision. And then there's another piece of the hippocampal entorhinal system that codes whether those two pieces are close to one another or farther away. So it's more of a distance metric. So what's interesting about that is that the brain does have a spot that builds these network maps of information that we are exposed to in the world.
And Perry, I'd like to turn just for a minute to philosophy, since we haven't touched on that much yet. And Foucault, after close to like 100 episodes of the podcast, and it's mostly been interviewing philosophers, Foucault hasn't come up yet on the podcast at all. And I know you've done a lot of work on his philosophy. And I just thought we might talk a bit about how he conceived of curiosity.
Yeah, Michel Foucault was a French theorist, really working in the 60s, 70s, 80s, early 80s. And one of the things he's best known for is insisting that power and knowledge can't be thought apart from one another. So he would consistently write power/knowledge or knowledge/power. So he wanted to think about how institutions, and especially hierarchical institutions, inform what we know and how we know it, and the questions we ask and how we ask those questions. So in a lot of ways, working through Michel Foucault's archive for me was helpful in raising these questions. Now, he was a huge fan of curiosity, so he said that curiosity was a cornerstone of his morals, which is an interesting statement to make it at all, to have curiosity be a cornerstone of your morals. But he also recommended, this is the thing that will let us continue to surprise ourselves and break out of ruts in the ways that we think about things and in the ways that we live with each other. That said, a lot of his work offers more of a springboard to thinking about curiosity for me, rather than a thought out kind of account of curiosity. So one of the things that I work on in particular, he described what he called discursive formations, which were ways in which how we talk about things gets formed. And it has formations. So there's a way in which we come to talking about whatever it is, fad diets, for example, or protein, or in this case, curiosity. Right? There are ways in which we talk about things that get rutted in and kind of stitched down. And we can start to talk about how those things got formed and what kind of histories those formations had, and how we might kind of tweak them and say, we could start talking about this in a different way. For him, for example, homosexuality was one of those things. And that was the term of the realm at that point, right? Homosexuality could be talked about differently, but this is the story of how it came to be talked about the way it was in 1970, for example. So I think about this in relationship to curiosity. I want to think not just about discursive formations, ways in which we talk about curiosity, but I want to talk about curiosity formations, ways we practice curiosity, ways we just assume this is how we ask questions. And those formations differ within fields, across fields, in different settings. So the way we ask questions in a classroom may be different than how we ask questions in the grocery store, may be different than how we ask questions when we're at our annual kind of national meeting of our societies, of our particular academic fields. How did those ways we ask questions get formed? For me, that's kind of the step I want to take past Foucault, but deeply, deeply indebted to Foucault.
And does this relate to the network account? Because the way that we came about to ask these questions is sort of framed in this network format, like something became solidified and we just repeat the same tracks in any given context, something like this?
Yeah, so I think there's two ways of saying this. One is to say, or two ways of answering this. One is to say that the really individualistic and acquisitional way in which curiosity has been talked about is itself a formation, a discursive formation. How we've talked about curiosity as an individual wanting to know a particular individual piece of information is a formation, a way of thinking about curiosity that needs to be broken, we argue in the book, and move to a network account. That said, networks offer, right, it's not just like there's one shape to a network. There's tons of different shapes to a network and ways in which the network itself works. And I think we could, Dani, maybe you can jump in here, think about formations, social formations of discourse or of questions as already a kind of a network structure.
Yeah, I think that is definitely true. Maybe one other thing that feels useful to add here is that even Foucault's connection between power and knowledge is something that's explicitly connective, and something that we care about and talk a teeny bit about in this book, although it's more a focus of your previous book, Perry. But I think that being able to connect knowledge with other things like affect, like power, like social structures, it becomes, or the body even, it becomes really important in a connective approach. And I think that that's certainly in line with what Foucault is thinking.
Before we move on from Foucault, something you said, Perry, that jumped out at me was that Foucault conceived of curiosity as the cornerstone of our morals. And I wasn't quite sure what that meant. So maybe you could say more about what you think he meant.
Yeah, so he said the cornerstone of his morals. So it's
His
one
morals.
of three. He has three moral pillars. One is curiosity, and one is refusal, and I think the third is innovation. I think, if I'm remembering correctly, but this is in an interview that he's doing, and people are sort of asking him for how should we then live, right? Give me the ethics for everyone. And he says, no, 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 no. I'm never going to do that. I'm never going to describe ethics for everyone or moral standards for everyone, but I will describe the pillars for me. And when he says refusal and curiosity and innovation, part of what he's suggesting is that it's not any given practice that is itself always right, but rather a comportment to noticing when violence or oppression or harm is happening, and refusing kind of the patterns that have led to that, and getting curious about other patterns, and then creating or innovating other ways of living. It's that process for him that is his ethics.
And Foucault aside, another group of philosophers that haven't come up on the show yet are, I don't know if you'd want to call them indigenous philosophers, but indigenous philosophy hasn't come up on the show yet. And you also tell a tale from the philosophy of people indigenous to the Great Lakes, which is actually where I'm from. I'm from Chicago. But can you tell this tale of, and I might butcher the pronunciation of the name, I think it's Nanabozo, and how it relates to your and Dani's account of curiosity?
Sure. I think it's, yeah, his name is pronounced in several different ways. I've heard it as Nana Bourgeois, but
Okay.
this story is told by a number of different indigenous theorists, some of whom are philosophers by self-description, and it's a story of what's understood as the first man in Anishinaabe literatures, and he's tasked with exploring the world. But that exploration is distinctly not to own or necessarily to know, but rather to relate to and learn from all four corners of the earth. And the recommendation for how he should go about traveling the world is that each step would be a greeting to the earth. And we spend some time on this in the chapter on walking, and we talk about walks on networks and walks across, therefore, knowledge networks, and curiosity and walking and all of this. But there's something really distinct about this call that each step of a walk be a greeting to the earth, not a claiming of the earth, and not a stamping on or planting a flag on the earth, but a greeting, this kind of relational approach to knowledge and to exploration that doesn't seek to own or dominate in any particular way. That seems to be a lesson that's not only really important for Anishinaabe culture, but also for theories of curiosity writ large.
And do you mind if I jump in here really quickly with a little bit of neuroscience? So there are some interesting reflections in contemporary neuroscience that align with this approach to thinking. So, for example, I was just at a meeting for the Society for Social and Affective Neuroscience, and one of the interesting discussions centered around when we are socially curious, when we are curious with another human. Is it that we are seeking information about that human? Do I want to know what you think about X, or do I want to understand your experience in Y? Or, and those would be kind of more nodal acquisitional curiosities. Or is it that I just want to relate? That I want there to be a channel of sharing between us? Is that what's actually driving me? And I don't care what it's about. I don't care what the end point is. I just care about this kind of this greeting, not of the earth, but of the other human. So it's interesting to think about even the laying down of that edge, the laying down of that relation as the motivation, independent of what's on the other side of it.
Mm-hmm. And it's interesting to think about these multiple dimensions of curiosity. One, there is curiosity is an avenue for connection with other people, but also an avenue for, as you put it, node acquisition. But speaking then of this node acquisition, could we talk a bit about how knowledge networks are built and how they grow? And in particular, I think this might be a nice time to talk about your study on Wikipedia users, because this was an interesting way that science or empirical studies connect with this book, this project.
Let me jump in and just sort of set up the Wikipedia study that we were able to be a part of. I was trying to think. I was getting really stuck on redefining curiosity, back in the day, and I decided, let's forget that and let's just think about describing curiosity and come up with a kind of a canon of descriptions of curiosity across the ages. And maybe the more we describe it, this is kind of going back to a very basic scientific instinct. Let's describe the thing first before we try to define what it is, right? Let's do some observation. So I was doing that by looking at descriptions of curiosity in Western intellectual history across a couple of thousand years. And one of the things I kept noticing is that certain terms were repeated a lot more than other terms, certain descriptors. And so the more I thought about that, the more I thought, these are types, I think, that are coming forward that are really consistent across eras of thought and even across languages and cultures. And so I named the first the busybody, because this is the term that comes up a lot. The busybody is someone who's curious about all kinds of things. So their knowledge network is super loose, right? They don't mind, they'll be interested in this and that and the other thing and have a million tabs open, and they feel really happy about it. And then there's a hunter, and this literally, the word for hunting in Latin and French and German and Greek, comes up repeatedly in connection with a curious person. A curious person is a hunter. This person is far more focused and doesn't want to get distracted by all the details, but rather is looking for a particular kind of river of inquiry, right? To sit in that river of inquiry and say, this is where I'm going. This is what I want to know about. And then the last is the dancer. I saw words like dance, but also words like leaping and jumping, and there was and imagination. There was some kind of curious person who really wanted to imagine and create in the moment that they were being curious. They weren't stuck with just collecting information that everybody else was gathering or kind of answering a particular question for themselves, but rather they wanted to make. They wanted to imagine. So that person's the dancer. So we have the busybody, the hunter, and the dancer as these types, or these characters in the history of Western thought who are curious. And then Dani said, well, I don't know, are those still here today?
Yeah, exactly. And so in trying to answer the question, are those styles still here today, we collaborated with David Leiden-Staley, who's at the Annenberg School of Communication at Penn. And he ran this study where he invited 149 participants to browse Wikipedia for 15 minutes a day for 21 days. And they consented to us downloading a little app onto their computer that would log which pages on Wikipedia they were going through. So not which pages they went throughout the entire internet, but which pages of Wikipedia they went to, how much time they spent on each page in Wikipedia, and how they transitioned from one page to another. So that's the information that we acquired. That means that we acquired over 5 hours of data per person. And collectively, over the 149 participants, we had over 18,000 pages visited in Wikipedia. So it was really a massive study that allowed us to understand more about how humans walk through an idea space. In this case, it's the idea space of an online encyclopedia. So then to address whether we saw these particular styles, what we did is that we calculated the semantic distances between any two pages that the humans walked between. And those semantic differences or distances are sort of assessments of the how different the meanings are of the two pages. To do that, we can use natural language processing techniques. And specifically, there's this a technique that's called the term frequency inverse document frequency, or it's a metric that quantifies how similar the terms are on the two pages after dismissing simple words like articles or prepositions or pronouns. So using that, we were able to determine whether a human was walking between nearby pages or more distant pages, whether they were taking small steps or leaps, and also whether they were coming back to earlier visited pages or sort of making triangles or clustered structures as they were walking. And by doing this, we could see that there's a whole continuum of human behavior, from people who are very busybody-like, or butterfly-like. Those are the people who are moving from one Wikipedia page to another that's wildly different. And then all the way through to people who are much more like the hunter, moving between pages that are really nearby, all focused on a similar set of ideas. And then there were people in between who really we couldn't categorize as either a busybody or as a hunter. They were kind of showing features of both. And so that was an exciting illustration, a use of existing contemporary techniques for online experiments, but also techniques in natural language processing to determine whether these same styles are alive and well today, which apparently they are. We are now in collaboration with the Wikimedia Foundation to move beyond the 149 participants to a much larger sample of data that's been collected completely in a completely anonymized way.
And at this point, I should probably point out that your book is rich not only with these great sketches from an artist, but your own sketches that I think you point out look as if they just could have been written on a pub napkin, as if you two were sharing them to one another. And they make this abstract discussion of graph theory and what these knowledge networks look like much more easy to perceive, I guess, quite literally. But how do these three archetypes relate to the way a knowledge network actually looks? Just granted, though, that we don't have these napkin drawings in front of us.
Yeah, sure. So the way that the let's see, if you took a bunch of spaghetti and you threw it at a wall, and you looked at where the pieces of spaghetti touched one another or intersected, and you allowed those intersections to be nodes, and then the spaghetti would like loop around in interesting ways. That might be slightly more like the busybody because it would be pretty chaotic. Whereas in contrast, if you took a bunch of marshmallows and toothpicks.
Wait, I got something better. What about ramen?
Okay.
The hunter is ramen uncooked. You know, when you first take it out of the bag, it's perfectly organized.
Ordered. Yes. I love that. Yeah. And I was going for like a lattice structure with marshmallows and toothpicks. But yeah, so the very, very ordered connectivity between local pieces. Mm-hmm. Oh, you can also think about the Eiffel Tower. That's pretty ordered too. Or the structure of telecommunications towers. They would be more hunter-like.
And I already alluded to this when I quoted the two of you saying that you're two bodies, one brain. But since I haven't made this clear yet, though I probably will in the introduction, you two are twins. And I'm curious, I mean, you two have very different manners of speech, and even though you're both university professors, you do quite different work. Do you take yourselves as instantiating the same archetypes? Because I would guess that Dani is probably a hunter and Perry, you're probably a busybody, maybe.
Yeah, we've chatted about this at some length, and we've sort of refused to settle down, which maybe makes both of us dancers at the most fundamental level. But both of us are really markedly interdisciplinary for our respective fields, maybe uncomfortably interdisciplinary for our respective fields. And so in that way, we're both busybodies, right? We aren't stuck in a particular place to talk and work, but we really like to constantly bring new things in. But Dani, maybe you want to chat about us as hunters and dancers.
Yeah, I think we've definitely also talked about being academics, that the hunter-like curiosity is one that is highly valued and that we have been trained in since we started in academia. So I think we both have qualities of the hunter that have allowed us to focus in on a particular set of problems and publish in the spaces that we publish. So we definitely have some of that as well. I think, though, that as we've been thinking through these 3 archetypes and then some others that we discuss towards the end of the book, we've been, I think, struck by the fact that there are different areas of different times or different areas of our life where we display all 3 styles. So I'll give maybe an example of working on a scientific research project. I think at the very beginning of a scientific research project, I start much more like the busybody or the butterfly. I read kind of eclectically. I go to conferences outside of my field. I listen to talks I wouldn't normally listen to. And I'm searching for a new idea. I'm searching for something to strike me as, that would be really exciting to think about in this new way. And then once I find something, then I become more of a hunter, and I, work through a very careful scientific study of that thing, whatever it was. And then towards the end of the project, when we want to describe how our discovery impacts other neighboring fields or non-neighboring fields, or how it alters how we think about existing theories or existing experiments or previous experimental data, then I become more of the dancer. I have to stitch together and sort of leap between theories or subdisciplines or other conversations, scholarly conversations, in a way that can sort of create a new space for this discovery to impact. So I think that an effective scientist will be one, and maybe an effective scholar, we could argue more broadly, will be one who moves between these 3 different styles in an efficient way.
And then another more personal question, but granted that the 2 of you are identical and that you ultimately collaborate on many of the same projects, granted these two things aside, have you thought about how it was that your knowledge networks formed differently and in such a way that resulted in you two going in these drastically different directions within the academy, that you ended up being curious about these different things?
One answer is that we're highly impressionable. So each of us took our first class in our separate disciplines in college and then fell in love. So Perry took his first philosophy class in college and just decided that was it. I took my first physics class in college and decided that was it. So one answer is that we're highly impressionable. Perry, maybe you had a different answer you were about to give.
Yeah, I guess for me it was more surprising to realize we after all of that parting of the seas, we ended up working on this roughly this same question later in life. And Dani was working on the neural flexibility necessary for learning, and I was working on the philosophy of curiosity, and that was like the main thing each of us was working on at a particular point, and we hadn't been talking a whole lot in the years leading up to that moment. And so the fact that we had been kind of going our separate ways for a bit of time and had landed in a similar position was part of the surprise of that for us, is part of what led us to actually collaborate and then on a variety of articles and then write this book.
Okay, and then, well, returning though now to our main thread, we talk and finishing off, I guess, with the archetypes and the Wikipedia study. We've talked about now how knowledge networks are built and how they grow, but so I'd like to turn then to how people actually navigate them. And Perry, in connection with Nana Bojo, you mentioned walks, and Dani, I think you mentioned walks as well. But before we get into the 4 kinds of walk, what is the motivation behind describing moving or navigating a knowledge network in this way? Is it just for illustrative purposes, to use this term, that it's more easily understood what you mean?
I think the answer might be different for each of us, but certainly from a scientific perspective, it is the technical term for how a network is navigated. It is walked. And there are different kinds of walks, and they're each described with specific equations, and it is like inherent to the math and to the vocabulary we use around the math. So it's formally, from the scientific perspective, it is that's what it is. It's walking. But I think what was really interesting is that when Perry started to think through these things, he used the word for maybe different reasons. And so we saw that there was an interesting resonance across the disciplines.
Yeah, I had shortly before we started talking through this book, I had taught a class on walking, on the philosophy of walking, and there's a number of books already published in that area, and then of course there's a long tradition of thinking about walking in environmental literatures more broadly, so not philosophy specifically, but environmental literature. And one of the things I was doing in the class was trying to explore how where we're walking and how we're walking in a space affects how we think. So then when Dani said, well, how we're thinking is really already in a space that we're walking, i.e. the network of knowledge, we just both went sort of. There was some really beautiful, this is probably the highlight of the moments where our fields kind of collided and sparks flew. So it just felt like we were already kind of saturated in the literatures in our own fields about walking, or that use the term walking. And then there was some incredible resonance when you start to think curiosity through these lenses, these respective lenses of walking.
The philosophy of walking, that sounds like a very interesting class. And in lieu of asking about that class, the first of the four walks that you described, these ways of navigating a knowledge network, is called the philosophical walk. So maybe you're the right person to tell me what that sort of walk is like.
Yeah, well, so the philosophical walk. First, I should just say there are many ways of navigating space that philosophers have used. So philosophers, a lot of the really well-known traditional philosophers in the Western canon have been avid walkers. So we could think about Rousseau or Nietzsche or Kant, or, as I do in this particular moment in the text, Socrates and Plato. And it was interesting for me to think about, okay, what are some kind of maybe styles or types of philosophical walks? And one would be Socrates, who, as we all know, if we've met him, he's just a wanderer, right? He just wanders around Athens, and he often doesn't seem to know where he's going, and he'll often stop for no apparent reason and stand for hours on end looking at nothing. He's always late to parties, just impossible to sort of corral, and this feels true of the early dialogues as well. They're just sort of all over the place. And then eventually there's, the sky opens and the sun shines at the end of the dialogue. And suddenly you see something you didn't see before that was being built very carefully, but you didn't know. So that's a particular kind of philosophical walk. Some of us do this really sort of haphazard, wandering around, trying a lot of different things out, poking holes in all sorts of places. And then suddenly where we're poking, the wall moves, like the whole wall moves, and you can now think a whole new realm. Whereas, Plato was Socrates' student and absolutely enamored with Socrates, but I'm sure frustrated by this lack of discipline in Socrates' own walking habits. And Plato is just, and you see this as the Plato's dialogues progress, really meticulous and earnestly invested in building knowledge piece by piece by piece. And those pieces are discovered or found by making separations or distinctions. And the more we can separate and distinguish, the more clearly we'll see this piece of knowledge can be built upon this piece of knowledge and then upon this piece of knowledge. And that's an entirely different kind of way of walking through concepts, walking through ideas. And these are two, figures at the very foundation of Western philosophy that, most folks, if they've ever taken a philosophy class or read a philosophy book, have met. And there's already at least two, right, ways of navigating ideas or walking through that knowledge space.
And then, Dani, this seems like it would be more up your alley, but are you familiar with any research that might explain why thinking and curiosity and walking are so closely associated? Does it maybe have something to do with increased blood flow, or just something as banal as being less distracted by other things?
It's so interesting. I haven't seen definitive work in this space. I think there are a lot of hypotheses out there, but it's a little bit unclear. It could be some of those answers, or some of the topics that you have just raised could be some of the answers. It could also be that we when we are walking, I mentioned earlier this hippocampal entorhinal system is the one that allows us to connect concepts or objects together in a network formation, and it's creating these concept maps all the time. Well, it turns out it's also creating physical maps of the world. So when we're walking from one part of a room to another part of the room, it's the hippocampus that's mapping out that physical space. So I also wonder whether the connection between physically walking and mentally walking, and their interesting correspondences is made possible by the fact that there's this single piece of the brain that's subserving both sorts of computations.
No, very neat. And okay, moving on though from the philosophical walk, I think the next sort of walk is the spiritual walk. And how does this differ from the philosophical walk?
So in all these cases, I'm trying to find shapes of walks, different shapes of walks that can we can add to the shapes of different walks on a network that have already been formalized in graph theory, for example. So I'm trying to think, what are the shapes? So if we have lattice and we have random walks and we have a bunch of other sorts of walks already formalized, what are some walks that have been somewhat formalized in philosophical writings that we could bring, shapes that show us ways of navigating conceptual space? And so for the spiritual walk, I talk a little bit about pilgrimages, which is a particular habit, and I talk specifically about sort of more Renaissance time pilgrimages to Jerusalem. So, and this is typically a pretty straight shot. You want to know where you're going, or you already know where you're going, because that's it's a sacred place. So you have to know where it is that you're going, and then you navigate it not really circuitously. There's typically a best way to get there. And there's all kinds of other rules, like you're supposed to have some kind of suffering on your way so that when you get there, you have some kind of absolution, et cetera, et cetera. But then, and that's pretty common in the sort of Protestant Catholic tradition of and sort of Judeo-Christianity more generally. But then there are other kinds of spiritual walks. For example, the labyrinth walk, which is more common in Eastern religions, where you're not going straight to a sacred space. It's actually this small negotiation of small spaces in a very heavily controlled pattern that allows you to come to the present, in a sense, to come to where it is that you already are. And that's where spiritual unity and enlightenment happens. So for me, it's just interesting to think about, there are these 1,000-year-old traditions of walks that show us ways of navigating how we think about the divine and our own calling in life, and what the good is, and how to reach that good in our minds, in our bodies, and in our souls. But they're differently shaped, and that seems to lend something to that. Really lends something to this larger question about curiosity, and perhaps in this case, spiritual curiosity. And might there be multiple shapes to that spiritual curiosity across the ages?
And then the last two walks are environmental and political. And part of me thinks that an environmental walk will involve a more circuitous route, one that involves stopping and meandering and enjoying and this sort of thing. Am I at all on the right track there?
Well, again, I draw on different environmental theorists who are going to have different kind of styles of walking in natural space. So, for example, Annie Dillard is going to be really different, or Virginia Woolf, than Thoreau and Emerson and Walt Whitman and the likes there, right? They're walking in different spaces. There's different areas of nature that call to them, and they tend to, the actual shape of their walks in their life and in their writings is quite different. But I wonder if we could bring more kind of, also bring this back to the questions of how it is that we ask our questions intellectually, and Dani, I wonder if you might think about citations as walks through knowledge space, and some of the work that we've done there. If that might bring it down to an example.
Yeah, that's a really good idea, and a good suggestion. So I think that when we work in scholarly spaces, we typically will cite the work of prior scholars or people who have published in the same space to say, so and so had this idea, we're building on that in this way, or our theory differs from the theory that was described in this other paper. So we have citations throughout the work that we do. This also occurs in journalism, even in articles in the New York Times, for example. They will cite a person who is working in that space or has an opinion about that topic. So one of the things that we've been doing is thinking about how the sort of trail of citations in a paper, this idea dependent on that idea, dependent on that idea, dependent on that idea, is like a walk through idea space. And then that motivates us to ask, what kind of walk is it that we are taking when we are creating citation trails in our scholarly work? And one way that we could make that trail or take that walk is by canvassing the existing work in a deliberately equitable way. So seeking out all of the people who have worked in this field and all of the ideas that are relevant. Alternatively, we could be walking in a way that is sort of what's called a biased walk, and that's a mathematical term, a biased walk where we tend to take steps in one particular direction or touch on particular nodes in a network more than others. It turns out that by studying how people actually fill out their reference lists, that most scholars in many different fields now of science that we've studied cite in an unequitable way. They're taking kind of a biased walk through the knowledge space, and it's biased by a couple of dimensions of privilege. One is race and ethnicity. So there's a sort of bias to tend to cite work by white scholars. There's also a bias in gender. So there's a tendency to cite more papers from men than from women, for example, or other gender minorities. And there are also correlations with the prestige of the institution that the scholar is affiliated with. So that's a really interesting example of how scholars are taking walks through idea spaces all the time and then kind of transmitting that walk to others in a way that can impact the way that they build their knowledge of the idea spaces. And we're committed to sort of raising awareness of this issue just to open the conversation around citing the work of minority scholars or marginalized scholars in a way that is more equitable.
Well, before we turn to more finish with some applications, I just had one final theoretical question. And we mentioned earlier that one of the strengths of this network account of curiosity is its substrate neutrality, because these knowledge networks on which curiosity is defined are represented abstractly. And I was wondering, since ChatGPT is definitely like the topic du jour, if you think large language models like ChatGPT meet your criteria for having curiosity.
Yeah, I'm really curious if Perry has an opinion about this, but I will say from my perspective, we're actually doing research right now to try to train artificial agents to display the same patterns of curious walking that we see in humans. So we can train them to act more like busybodies in a knowledge space or act more like hunters in a knowledge space. And I think that's really interesting and exciting for two reasons. One is that the agents can then be used to investigate spaces in a different way. So rather than foraging or this sort of more acquisitional approach, they would be explicitly connecting. But it's also interesting because we can use those artificial agents to compare to humans and understand a little bit more about precisely what mechanisms, from a mathematical modeling perspective, explain human behavior. So they can sort of fill this role of hypothetical humans, and that can help us to distinguish between theories. So I'm excited about that. What I'm left asking, however, is if we have trained these artificial agents to display connective patterns of curiosity, does that mean they're curious?
Mm-hmm.
And I think that is a bigger question and a different question. I can only say that they display the patterns of curiosity we coded them to display. So that's where I am.
Yeah, and I think building on that, I mean, I am, again, I'm more interested in asking where are questions getting asked and how are they getting asked and what can we learn about that there. And so for me, again, I wouldn't close the door immediately and say, well, curiosity is limited to organic life. For example, I would rather say, how is curiosity working here? So, okay, it's getting trained. Does that make it, how different from human curiosity does that make it? And for me, what's a little bit more interesting there is to simply acknowledge, humans are trained in their curiosity all day long. Like we I don't know. I think we act like when we become adults, we get to ask our own questions, but most of us have passed through 12 years, if not more, of highly organized, structured education that keeps telling us how to ask questions and what to ask questions about and how people have asked questions before us and the good ones and the not good ones. So our curiosity is heavily, heavily trained also. And so I'm interested in thinking in that kind of complex space of what is there something else other than the training that goes into each case, or what are the kind of social structures that can explain differences in training of systems versus humans, et cetera, et cetera. That's interesting, right? That opens a whole world of other things to start noticing and observing and analyzing and studying and publishing about. So I would rather come at it from that perspective rather than immediately say, no, of course they're not curious.
And these constraints on our curiosity that you mentioned bring me to the last question that I had for today, which is, in the last chapter of your book, you discuss how all this work on curiosity should inform the way that we educate ourselves and others. And I'm wondering what your main takeaways from this were. And in particular, you write about Leonardo da Vinci, who's always a fascinating character to hear about. So I was curious if you could say a bit about how he enters this discussion.
Yeah, well, Leonardo da Vinci is often held up as a paradigm or a paragon of curiosity, right? Of a curious person, someone who's capable of art and science and language and history and all these other things. And he's important and helpful in that respect. And it leads us back to Dani's point about citations, right? When we talk about Leonardo repeatedly, we often will miss other paragons of curiosity who come from other backgrounds and have other practices and might bring other things to the table, perhaps styles of curiosity, perhaps ways of asking, et cetera, et cetera. So part of what we do in that very last chapter is address some of these social inequities that inform how curiosity gets practiced, especially in learning settings. So education, formal education, yes, but also there's a lot of learning settings that are not just in schools. So many folks have to learn things on their job. They learn things at home. They learn things in their community organizing space. They learn things from friends. In all of those cases, how can we think about busting open some of the really restrictive tracks that have limited, again, not only what gets asked, but who gets to ask it and who gets seen as automatically a viable leader in the space of knowledge. Dani?
Yeah, maybe I think it's also worth bringing it back to a single human too, and how we can engage in self-education in continually as we grow and change throughout our lifetimes in a way that embraces the diversity of curious expressions or styles that exist in the world. And so perhaps, I mean, for us, for example, or for anyone who was trained to highly value the hunter-like curiosity, to sort of consider in what ways has that limited the questions that we ask and the ways that we've continued to educate ourselves as adults? And can we consider embracing these other styles, the busybody and the dancer? In what ways would that change how we engage in self-education in our adult life?
Well, it was great not just to talk about curiosity with the two of you, but to have two thinkers who, although obviously collaborating, are coming at it from such different perspectives and with different styles. So thanks so much for talking with me about Curious Minds.
Thanks for having us.
Hold on, Geeslings. Before you go, please like, subscribe, follow if you haven't already. Smash all those buttons. And also, if you haven't followed me on Twitter at Robinson Earhart, or if you're not joining me every morning as I eat my pint of ice cream on Twitch at Robinson Earhart on Robinson Eats, please do so.